So in our last series, we spoke about spiritual parenting and how to support our children to remain open to their spirituality and to improve the quality of our exchange with them. Now, we can also talk a little bit about the development of the child's personality in the early years in relation to the parents and how the parents support that child's development in other ways. Perhaps the most important expression of spirituality that we can understand as human beings is love. And even this is hard to explain, but this is an unconditional giving and accepting and an ability to maintain an open space to see, in this case, our children develop to the highest potential that they can be and give us the space to become the best parents we can be in that process. So there were some books written some years ago by a man named Gary Chapman called The 5 Languages of Love of Children. And in this, there were children that were interviewed and asked, how do you feel really loved by your parents? And parents were also asked, how do you perceive that you love your child? So it ended up being 5 major categories or ways. And I just want to share a little bit about that because I think it's important, because as part of the spiritual education of children, it's also the actual exchange in our lives day to day that we have to look at and say, how do we express our love as parents to our children? How do they receive that love? And so on. So the 5 expressions of love and the wounding that can come when these expressions are absent for children. The first is physical touch and affection. And by this we mean physical contact of a loving nature, hugs and kissing and play and tickling and just holding the child with a sense of reverence and safety and allowing physical connection to be safety for them. There are, of course, ways in which this can not be present as a child is growing up, unfortunately, in dysfunctional situations. For example, physical touch and affection could be used in a dysfunctional way through incest, through inappropriate touching, and so on, or through active abuse and violence. And this, of course, can create huge traumas for the child as they grow up. At the same time, sometimes there's a lack or an absence of physical touch and affection. Perhaps the parents are hesitant because they have never had this before, or maybe it is an expression of not really having wanted the child or feeling some issue around that child, which is part of their past and their wounding. But the child, unfortunately, gets the expression of that. And in each case, as we speak of these 5 ways of love and wounding, is that a child can take on one of 3 roles in relation to not feeling loved in these 5 ways we're describing. One can be the role of victim, and the other is the role of rescuer, and the other is the role of abuser. I'm going to find the reasons. So I could just, yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what happens when we are receiving love from our parents through these 5 different ways that I'll be describing. Normally, these roles I'm going to speak of, the victim, abuser, rescuer roles, are not really present in the child as they grow up to be adults and then they have relationship. But when there is a lack of connection or there's an aggressiveness in the parents, then these different roles can emerge. And so as adults, we can actually re-experience our childhood wounding through these roles that we took on or that we learned from our parents. So I want to describe just very briefly these roles. Who is the abuser? The abuser role could sometimes be played out in our own partnerships or even with our children when we're adults through active aggression, through anger, especially when we're stressed, frustration, impatience, sometimes regrettably violence, arrogance or demanding perfection from our children, domination or even criticism. Yeah? And the victim role would be, we could be in a parental situation where we feel victimized by our circumstances because we may have felt that before when we were growing up. We can become helpless, hopeless, despairing, depressed, have low self-esteem, feel a lot of self-rejection within ourselves, even shame or big fears, isolation, withdrawal from life. And if we experience this growing up because of ways that we weren't loved or the impact of situations in our family, then we might find ourselves giving the same thing to our children. Hopefully not, but it does happen quite often. The rescuer role is a little different. It's that of being self-sacrificing, suffering to love, giving too much, feeling guilty. When something goes wrong, you take on the responsibility for it rather than seeing who had what part to play in it, you know. Worrying a lot, anxiety, becoming the martyr, we call it the martyr syndrome, caretaking, over caretaking, enabling, like putting up with behaviors that really are not constructive to the child, and becoming over responsible for situations. So these three roles, we often find ourselves, one of these three roles, or maybe a couple of the roles we take in relation to our family, our partnership, and our children. For example, I had one client who was a man who had a very big position in a company, and when he was at work, he had more the abuser role. He was commanding and domineering. Then when he came home in relation to his wife, he felt like the victim. And then in relation to his kids, he saw himself as the rescuer. So we could take on several roles depending on the situation and what we're in. On the other hand, what we want to do is really free ourselves up from these dysfunctional, limiting roles and live with more love and awareness in supporting our children. So the first way that we can support our children is through physical affection and touch. From that, the second area that is an expression of the love we share with our children and what they feel they can receive in the way of love from us. Words of affirmation and kindness. And that's really, you did a good job, you're wonderful, I love you, big words, and important words for the child to hear. But they're also important words for us to share with each other as adults in our relationships. That kind of support is good, and it goes a long way, especially in encouraging the children to be themselves and that they did a good job, but not only a good job, but that you just really love them just the way they are, that they're just beautiful beings and you're really happy they're with you. So words of encouragement can be also words of praise, but they can be words of adoration and gratitude for the child. Now, sometimes words, regrettably, can be misused, and in some families, because of perhaps the stress of the parents, or perhaps the misbehaviors in the children that the parents don't know how to correct or change, that the child can be, the parent can express criticism or harsh words to the child. And if they don't balance that by really, they can criticize perhaps or critique the behavior of a child, but unfortunately some parents go further. They actually criticize the self-value of the child when they're really wanting to ask the child to change their behavior. I had an example of this with a patient, a man that came in and he was always afraid that he might hurt someone because he felt he was somehow bad, he was evil. And it was a strange idea and belief he held, but as we explored it, we came to find out that his mother, unfortunately, had a mental illness. She had been schizophrenic and had a paranoid tendency. And sometimes when he was a child, he would misbehave, and she would say, "You're the son of a dictator, you're Hitler, Stalin," somebody. And he would actually take these words in. And he believed that his misbehavior were signs of something worse in his character. So he had grown up with this fear that if he exerted any kind of healthy assertiveness or aggression, or even joy, spontaneity, he would become a very bad figure, like those in history. So it took a lot for him to transform this and to realize this was really the stressed out voice of his mother that was creating this circumstance for him. Other words, sometimes a parent can be focused much more on the, how can we say, that the child has to perform well. And some parents also grew up with a sense that performance is love. If they did a good job, then their parents would love them. If they didn't do a good job, they weren't loved. So sometimes parents carry on the patterns of belief and emotions they received from their parents. And in this case, one could carry that on by only rewarding the positive achievements of the child, but not really showing the child an unconditional love. And unfortunately, that happens more often than we would like to see between parents and children. Even when parents have a deep love for children, sometimes they get caught in that kind of over-performance-oriented, I would call it conditional love. If you do good, I'll praise you and I'll love you, and if you do bad, I'm not going to like you, which is conditional. Quality of time spent together is the third area in which children experience being loved and parents experience loving. By quality time, we mean time that's really on the child. It's an interactive time that's both for child and the parent, but it's time for the child to develop, to learn skills, to grow, but especially to enjoy being with their parent and enjoy activities, games, playing, time out in the park to play, time for vacation, just time to be together in a fun way and in a way that helps the child feel connected to the family. Unfortunately, sometimes some parents have no time for this, or they leave it to babysitters, or they simply don't have that with their children. They just are too busy to have it. Or they create, it's all on their time. So maybe the child would love to go, say, to a museum or to do something, to learn things, and that parent instead is saying, now we need to go to the grocery store and we need to go to the bank together and so the child is oftentimes seen pulling the parent, saying, no, I want to go, and then they get disciplined for it, and so the whole experience of spending time together becomes almost like a boring punishment instead of something that's enriching to the child and to the parents together. So those special occasions, I remember, and I also, as I talk to a lot of people in therapy, working with them, that they will keep vivid memories of those special occasions they spent with their parents, going on an outing or going somewhere. One of our grandchildren, we took him to a science museum, and he loved it so much. He's been talking about it for several years since, that when are we going to go back? What are we going to do? I remember, and it was so much fun, not only for him, but for us as well. So quality time spent together is important. The fourth area where love can be expressed between parents and children are acts of service and caring. Another way to say is education. So this could be as simple as the parent teaching the child how to brush their teeth properly, how to make their bed, how to get to bed on time, how to even do some activity that they need to learn to do later in life if it's appropriate for their age, and so on. So our education in the way of helping them sometimes with their homework, if they need help, if we feel capable of doing it, or getting help for the child in some way that the child may need. So just recognizing that and offering the child. So it's more a matter of education. So if one is neglecting that process, sometimes the child grows up and has very little basic life skills. I have actually known some adults that as children became very shamed and afraid of going to school because they didn't even know how to tie their shoes. And you know, these are extreme examples, but nevertheless, you know, sometimes as parents we also leave the education to an older son or daughter to give the younger one, but that's not always the appropriate thing to do. I think we have to be involved directly with the child for that. At other times, the experience of education for a child can be hurtful. For example, if a parent is very demanding and expects that child to learn something the first time they do it, and then if they don't learn it correctly, they criticize the child. It could be not only with schoolwork, it just could be with life activities. That can also be a difficult thing. Sometimes I see this with people who who suffer from low self-worth because they may have had a parent, a father, or a mother that was constantly criticizing their behavior and their learning skills, so they never really felt that they could achieve enough. Or sometimes the parents can be extremely demanding of the achievement of a child. One client I had was a man who actually was in a very high-level university, who was making high grades up to the point of almost perfection, maybe 99 on a score of 100, and had vivid memories of his father, when he would show him his report card, say to him, "What happened to you? You didn't make a perfect score," and criticize him and punish him for that. Consequently, this boy developed an obsessive-compulsive disorder. He, at some points in his later education process, he couldn't work. He was paralyzed with fear because it was never going to be good enough. And that was the message he got, that he would never be loved because he would never be good enough. And when the parents were questioned, it became obvious that the father, and especially, had had a difficult time himself in school, wanted to see his son achieve so badly that he pressured him and pushed him way beyond his limits, obviously. And the boy was doing just fine with school. So it took a lot to help him get out of this behavior. The fifth area that we have of the sharing of love is what we call gifts, sharing and giving. And this could involve a lot of material gifts, for example, or different exchanges or activities. It could be simply, for instance, that the mother or grandmother bakes a special cake or a chocolate dish or whatever the child really loves, and is offering that to the child just in the afternoon when they come home from school. It's an act of giving from the heart. So the question becomes, whatever you are giving in the way of material goods, food, activities, if it's coming from your heart as a parent, then it's a true giving, and the child will receive that as a true giving. If, on the other hand, it's about duty, if it's about being frustrated in doing it, or simply never doing it because there's no, quote, time for it, then that child may develop a sense of not deserving, and not deserving material things, not deserving its needs to be met in the way of material goods or other things in life. So these 5 ways of the exchange, of the giving and receiving of love, quite often later in life lead to certain patterns. So for example, we don't want to go too much into this yet in terms of partnership, but in this series to talk just a bit about how, for instance, we choose partnership. So that if we have what we call a wounded inner child or an early childhood issue, and we are holding one of these roles of victim, abuser, or rescuer, that we may be attracted to a partner who carries a positive energy which counteracts the wounded energy that we had. And the same for us with them. So sometimes partnerships begin as healing liaisons or partnerships, because maybe the partnership hasn't really developed at an adult level yet, but there's a exchange of healing that goes on with the inner child within both partners. And that can work well for a while, but in order to emerge into adult partnership, we need to take charge of our own healing and come to peace with it and not force our partners to be our mothers or fathers that we didn't have. Because oftentimes, even when we see our partner as the mother or father we didn't have, that's the ideal, the inner child sees them that way, sooner or later there will be disappointment, because we're human beings, and being human, we have traits that go both ways. So instead of treating our partnership as a healing of our childhood, it's to find the adult side of it. And to do that, we have to take responsibility for our own healing. And perhaps in a later talk, we'll talk more about partnership healing. But for now, what happens as a result of wounding around these 5 ways of the giving or receiving of love is we create what I would call, or what Daskalos, the Cypriot mystic, called elementals. They are thought emotion complexes which we hold in our body and our mind, and they are beliefs that are coupled with an emotion, a strong emotion. So whenever we, for instance, we might feel that I don't deserve love, I will never be able to be loved, or I have to prove myself to be loved, when something triggers us in a partnership that smells or looks like what we grew up with, we may, because of the trauma we experience, move back into that role that we had as a child in some manner. And this process, these elementals I talk about, these emotion thought complexes, they tend to be memories that are held in what we call our energy centers in our body, our chakras, or in Indian Hindu philosophy they call them chakras, or wheels of etheric energy. But they are actually, our little brains are part of a system of awareness that come through our nerve plexuses and different parts of our body. So we have what's called the root center at the base of our spine. We have the sacral center in our pelvis, the solar plexus center in our abdomen, the heart center here in our chest, the throat center in our throat, the sixth center, our thought center, our visualization center here in our forehead, and our crown center here. And each of these, each of these chakras is connected through the plexuses also to certain glands that create hormonal system release. So whenever we are in a good state, they're releasing certain hormones. When we are in a stress state, they release certain hormones. And our body then starts to respond, of course, to the memories we had before, and that feeds our mind, these thoughts, and our mind starts, making the decision again, and it feeds the whole process of building more those thoughts and emotions within us. So we call them elementals. They are in our energy field, and when they activate again, they become active within us. There's a story, for instance, in the Bible, parables of Jesus about, it's called the man in the desert. So there was a man who kept a clean home, and then he went away, and when he came back, it was in a mess, a disarray. And he had to clean it again, and so on and so on. And so in a way, it's really, in a modern sense, about us keeping our energy centers clean and recognizing that when we go unconscious in ourselves, when we're not being responsible for our thoughts and emotions and working them through when we need to, we're not keeping our inner house tidy and clean, our energy system tidy and clean. And so we are having these little elementals or little devils, so to speak, coming in because they're sitting in our energy field in our subconscious, but it's also our energy field surrounding our body etherically. And they will come in, and then they start to activate and create patterns that we often had before, and they're triggered by association with things. So we have these 7 file drawers, we would say, in which we carry these things. And very briefly, the first is our survival center, our root chakra, our grounding, and our self-image. Also our capacity to be in the world in a healthy way, our health, our home space, our ability to have survival, to survive and to make money and so on. Our second chakra center, or an energy center, is our emotions, our passion, our sense of joy, our ability to celebrate, our capacity for emotional intimacy and sexuality. Then our third center is our power center, the solar plexus. It's what we call our achiever. It's the part of us that we get involved in work and building things, creating discipline, our control of our environment, and our achievement. So again, we could say the first center is our natural self, and our physical instincts. The second center is the lover, so to speak, and the poet, the artist. The third center is the warrior, but also our worker, And the fourth center, the heart, is the king and queen within us. It's our organizer. It's the one that brings right order to our lives and carries our ethical values and how we can attune to our children, to our partners, to life, and bring the best. Right? And it connects us from here up to our soul. So our heart gives us our values and why we're really here and who we really are. And then our throat chakra is our communication center and how we use our communication center, our expressor, and our creative center for expression and for speaking our needs. And then the brow center, we call it, is the visionary. It's the one that understands, the one that sees and brings a certain plan to life and sees the future, understands the past, and builds our intuition. And then the crown center is what we could call our seer, our prophet, the one that connects us to the divine and to the dimensions and to ourselves as energy beings. So in each case, each of these centers can hold certain woundings from our life and certain ancestral patterns. So part of the process of becoming spiritual parents and becoming spiritual partners to our partners and living a spiritual life in the world is getting to know ourselves and learning to become responsible for our own thoughts and emotions and reactions, and to study ourselves, to examine ourselves deeply, to introspect about who we are really, as opposed to our little personality quirks and responses to things, our reactivity. What we carry in the way of these elementals, we mentioned that our children can perceive and sense energies. Sometimes our children may actually sense our elementals as parents. They may see things that represent certain subconscious elementals we hold, which either are really positive for them or frightening for them. Or on the other hand, they may perceive these things in their teachers and other children, or in our family system in some manner, or even from ancestries. So it's important to be open to that and to recognize that sometimes children can be our greatest teachers. They can point out something that we are having as an elemental in our field that they are signaling, seeing, feeling, and that we need to consider as well. Quite often children will hold these elementals from their mother and father, and sometimes these energies will disturb the child. And if the child feels themselves moving too much into the role of, say, a victim, maybe they may choose, in order to get attention from the parents and love, choose illness as a way to draw attention because they don't know how else to communicate it or do it. It's just one example of many. So it is, in fact, our responsibility to work on our own healing as adults, as parents, whether that's after we've had children or even before we start the process with children. So what I'd like to do now is just a short meditation for you to connect with your children inside and also your inner child in your healing process.